Time, huh?
Yeah, that's fine. I'll get started with some
Sure.
basics here and then we'll get rolling. So, well, I want to welcome you to our last evening of the Munch on this series. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Trish Faring. I'm the field representative and range management specialist for the North Dakota Grazing Lands Coalition. And we developed this series basically as a replacement for our mentor guided workshop that we had planned on having in October and decided against having because of COVID. And I think it's been a great way to communicate with everybody and bring in people that typically maybe wouldn't have been able to attend in person otherwise. So I'd like to thank the board for supporting it and backing us to do this. So if at any time during the recording you guys have any issues, if you want to type into the chat, I'll try to help you as best I can. I have had the question come up about Becky's screen being blurry, but it's your camera, correct, Becky? That
it is. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So no, it's fine. I just wanted to clarify, so I didn't get the question 5 more times, but
but the PowerPoint will be clear.
Right. Yes, it should be good.
Yep.
The meeting this evening is being recorded. It's also on Facebook Live, and then we will get it posted to our YouTube channel here in a day or two, and then it should also be on the Grazing Land Coalition website. So if I can, I think everybody's already muted. I really haven't had to ask about that at all. So thank you, and I appreciate that very much. This evening, we did have a couple of sponsors join us toward the end of our series. One of them is the North Dakota chapter for the Wildlife Society, so we'd like to thank them for their sponsorship. And then also joining us this evening, and I'm going to give her the chance to say a little bit here, is Valerie Fralick from the Morton County Soil Conservation District. And so I'll turn it over to you, Val, and I'll let you introduce our speaker for this evening. And thank you for joining us.
Sure, thank you. Hi, I'm Valerie with the Morton County Soil Conservation District, and I guess I just would like to make everybody a little bit aware what the Morton County SCD has to offer before I introduce our speaker. First of all, we do have a grant program called the 319 Watershed, which covers the areas of Danzig Dam, Hailstone Creek, and the Big Muddy watersheds. And this program provides technical, financial, and educational assistance to agricultural producers and the landowners within that watershed. One of the other programs that we offer is called our OMG Grassland Improvement Project. And this OMG program helps implement conservation practices such as improving grazing systems, maintaining water and soil quality, and providing wildlife habitats. The OMG project covers producers in the Oliver, Morton, and Grant counties. Both of these programs do provide a variety of technical and financial and educational assistance. So if anybody has any questions on these programs, they can contact the Morton County SCD for more information. And now I would like to introduce your speaker. Rebecca Phillips collaborates with the NGOs, universities, and government institutions as an independent scientist specialized in ecosystem, carbon and nitrogen biochemistry, and regenerative agriculture. Her background includes biology and chemistry of carbon in plants and soils at the University of Michigan, Duke University, and the University of North Dakota. Phillips has also published new remote sensing-based models for agriculture, the fate of carbon in the soil food web, exchange of trace gas using flux measurements, tracking the fate of nitrogen in soils and plants, and development of quantitative methods. Phillips received an MS in rangeland ecology at Colorado State University and a PhD in environmental science and engineering at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She works with the North Dakota Grazing Land Coalition and is adjacent facility at the College of William and Mary in Virginia and Land Care Research in New Zealand. Please welcome Dr. Rebecca Phillips discussing what grassland managers want to know about carbon and methane. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Valerie. Okay, I'll go ahead and get down to it. The objective today is to review current knowledge of grassland carbon for the purpose of enhancing knowledge among ranchers and farmers. Methane being a form of carbon I will also touch on in grazing land systems. And so in a nutshell, I will outline who I am, the basics of the carbon cycle, and important factors to consider, issues to do with grassland carbon and grazing, as well as carbon sources and sinks. I wanted to briefly touch on who I am so that you know that I have some credentials behind me in terms of experience and publications in this field. I started at Duke University at the Duke Forest looking at elevated carbon dioxide and its effect on forest ecosystems and how increasing the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere alters the entire ecosystem in terms of where the carbon goes and how it's utilized. And I've been to worked with a few different agencies, the last of which was the Crown Research Institute in New Zealand, where I was a research leader there. And then I came back to the States and now I operate independently. I have over 50 peer-reviewed publications, which if any of you have ever tried to publish in the scientific peer review process is a little daunting at first, but it's a lot of work. And so I wanted to just make note of that. This is my latest publication in the peer-reviewed journal, Determining Factors Controlling Abiotic Co-denitrification, which is a nitrogen concept or a nitrogen cycle element. More relevant, I think, here is that I do have a successful farming article, not peer-reviewed, but penned by Raylene Nickel, which talks about grazing and carbon that you can look at. It just came out in January. Some people have asked, well, what is carbon and why do we care about it? And so I like to just touch on the fact that carbon is an element that is unique in that it bonds easily with itself and other elements. And so that's why we find it everywhere. And the fact that carbon is simply recycled. This whole concept of considering how carbon dioxide in the air is assimilated by plants and then goes into roots and soil and microorganisms, into grazers in this case, and on. The entire what they call life cycle is something that we hear more and more about. And the carbon can be found in what they call the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the pedosphere, the atmosphere, and the biosphere. And it's the biosphere, the biology, that really can accelerate those transformations of carbon. And when I talk about carbon today, I'm going to primarily focus on organic carbon. And that would be that carbon that happens after plants photosynthesize it, because that's what's most relevant in grazing land systems. So I'm going to, not knowing exactly the level of understanding of everyone here on this call, some of these concepts may be new and some may be not so new, but carbon stocks, in terms of how much carbon do you have below ground, is one measure of carbon when we're talking about organic carbon in grasslands. Another measure of carbon is the rate at which it accumulates. And so carbon stocks are typically referred to in terms of tons per acre. So if you say, well, I have a grassland here in Mackenzie, and I think I've got 20 tons per acre or 100 tons per acre, that's a fixed pool, which we call a stock. And that varies from what we call a rate of accumulation, which I've measured, which is how quickly does your system accumulate CO2? Am I accumulating carbon at 10 tons per acre per year, or am I accumulating carbon at 5 tons per acre per year? that tons per acre per year number, of course, is going to vary with the weather. And so I like to try to touch on that with people so that when ranchers are talking about carbon, they're kind of conceptualize the difference between the two. Both of them are helpful. If I go out and take soil cores and say, okay, you've got 100 tons per acre in this ground down to 24 inches, that's an important number. But the rates, the rate at which it's accumulating, helps us understand what's affecting that increase in soil carbon and what's affecting that number. The accumulation is something that may have accumulated over hundreds, thousands of years. We don't know. But sometimes it's very understanding the rates or how many tons per acre per year is much more difficult to get a good number on that because it takes much more sophisticated instruments. So if we first talk about grassland carbon stocks, then we can say, we can take an example here of a study that was published by Burke et al. And I studied with her when I was in Colorado. And in this case, she went through how much carbon is being taken into those plants, how much is being respired. And the difference is your net accumulation. She also talked about how much is below ground, and in biomass is in roots, and how much is in microbes, how much is in soil organic matter, in order to get an idea of what the total ecosystem pool might be. So you get so you can, again, it sort of reinforces this idea that you've got a rate, in this case up here, versus a stock down here. In terms of tons per acre, what she found, and this was in the short grass steppe, which is not nearly as productive as most North Dakota grasslands, she found 0.3 tons per acre, but below ground, she found 4 tons per acre in root biomass and what they call soil organic matter, 31 tons per acre. So this is why when people talk about how many tons per acre do you have and how important is soil organic matter, in grasslands, it tends to be a pretty big number relative to your above ground biomass. In the literature, you might find 85 tons per acre in temperate grasslands globally. You might find some studies that say 170 tons per acre or 100 tons per acre. And how many tons per acre you have depends on how deep you're talking about going and where exactly you are, what kind of climate are you working with, as well as management and other things, and what kind of species, etc. So just as one example in this paired land use study, where the question was, if you take conservation reserve program grasslands and you compare it to a neighboring small grain field, are you going to see any difference in carbon stocks over approximately 20 years? And are you going to see any difference with depth? And so the importance of this paired land use study was in that you wanted to see, well, are we finding that leaving the grass idle, are we going to, compared to cultivating it every year and planting small grains, we would expect to see a significant difference. And so these are just, this was an on-farm study looking at different sites in mostly south central North Dakota, where we took these deep soil cores and we wondered, where would we find the differences with depth? And in general, what we found was that most of the differences in the carbon were in the top 6 inches or so. And there was a pretty significant difference in the bulk density. So we found the soils were much lighter in those that had been converted to grasslands. And we found that overall, when considering soil equivalent mass, we had about 5.7 tons per acre difference, or over 20 years, that would be about 500 pounds per acre per year. Not quite as significant as we had thought, but there was definitely some difference. Now, this was a study where we looked at the native prairie in terms of roots, compared that to an adjacent crop field, and we scanned these different roots, and you can see all of these panels right here are root scans, and you can compare them to the crop field here of root scans. And the amount of roots, of course, in the native prairie, as you would expect, is high, much higher than even going down to 3 feet down in the crop field. So this is an important concept, that your prairie roots or your grassland roots go much deeper, they're much more extensive, and that has a lot to do with your soil carbon. And on top of that, this is a graph showing you, here is the crop field oxygen content this is the crop at 6 inches, and this is the crop field oxygen content at 24 inches. So you can see closer to the surface, we're getting closer to that 20% oxygen level. And this is time you've got on the bottom. So this is just basically from January 25th to February 3rd. And you can see much more vacillation in oxygen content here, but still in the crop field, you're not getting below 19% oxygen, your crop field oxygen. Now, up here, you're seeing the native grassland at 6 inches and compared to the native grassland at 24 inches. And you can see how, even though these sensors are spatially distinct, the seemingly parallel relationships you're finding there. So even though this right here, this one at 24 inches is 18 inches below the sensors here, there's a connectivity, so to speak, where you're seeing that oxygen level, when it goes up here, it's also going up here, suggesting that all those that you're seeing the soil sort of breathing, you're seeing that oxygen from above is also connected to down below, most likely due to those roots and that connection above and below ground with the roots, and the permittivity or the diffusivity of the oxygen that can make it down here. When it comes to the up here, it also does down here. So why do we care about things like soil oxygen and diffusivity and roots? And one thing that I did a lot of work on was methane, and that is that methane, which is just another form of carbon, which instead of carbon with 2 oxygens, you've got carbon with 4 hydrogens. And that methane, when there's that connectivity or passageway from the surface down below, that methane can actually diffuse through that soil. And there are organisms in that soil that actually eat the methane for energy. So the more that oxygen can diffuse down into the soil, and the more oxygenated it is, the more these organisms can take the methane, and what they do is literally use it for energy. And so that's one of the ways that methane can be assimilated into the system. So when we think about grazing and cattle grazing and the methane that is effused from the ruminant's mouth, you can imagine that some of that methane is being taken up by the soil, is being diffused into the soil, where those soil organisms are literally taking that methane, assimilating it, using it for their own growth and reproduction. So it's a system that is where some of that carbon is conserved, if you will. Now the methane, which they call eaters or the methanotrophs, are very sensitive to tillage, and they're sensitive to heavy amounts of nitrogen. So in a grassland system, they're more, it favors those methanotrophs, those organisms, because you don't have all that disturbance, you don't have all those nitrogen inputs. And so the likelihood for that methane to diffuse down to those organisms and to be utilized is much greater. And the more methane you provide these organisms, the faster they use that methane. So it's what they call a first order relationship.
Becky, I have a
Yeah.
question that popped up about, I think it was the chart that you had where the crop and rangeland were compared, and then there was like a spike in that every so often.
Yeah.
They were asking, what are the spikes and why don't you see that as much in the crop field?
Well, that's a great question. The crop field was much more compacted, and so that the ability for that oxygen to diffuse down into 24 inches was very limited. So that's why they were spatially distinct.
Okay, so it was basically the oxygen levels though that you were recording there and the spike
Yep.
in, correct? Okay.
Right.
Clarifying for the question. So thank you.
Yeah. So getting back to the carbon and whether you have carbon rates or carbon stocks, we're kind of going back to that figure by Burke et al., where again, she said you can look at the stocks and you can measure how much you have, and look at the different places where you might find carbon, because we know carbon is conserved. We know that if those plants take up a certain amount of carbon dioxide and then they photosynthesize a certain amount, some is going to be respired and some is going to be assimilated, some is going to be translocated into the ground, some is going to be assimilated by microorganisms, some is going to be turned into soil organic matter. But if in an ideal world you could imagine 100 grams of photosynthate and actually figure out where those 100 grams ended up, if you will. And those kinds of tracer studies are what I used to do. And you can actually trace them into different microorganisms to see which ones are using the carbon and how they're affected by different disturbances. So the rates give you a better handle on what is going on, what's causing that these things to occur, what's causing the increase or decrease in soil carbon more specifically. And to do that, we use systems such as this one, which is an eddy covariance system, which is measuring about 20 times per second and actually figuring out how much carbon and water vapor is being either removed from the system or gained from the system. So there's a net gain. So in the nighttime, you might see that those plants are respiring more. In the daytime, they're photosynthesizing more. And that net over time is what you're looking for. And that way you can see, well, how does more rainfall and how does warmer temperatures and how do all these things alter whether you're getting a net carbon sink or a net carbon source. So we've done these kinds of studies in grasslands, as well as this was an alfalfa field, where you can actually see every half hour average on what's going on. When you cut the alfalfa or you cut the grass, how does that affect the ecosystem exchange of carbon? So ultimately, carbon is going to be dominated by the plants, and the net gain of the plants. So if you have a high amount of photosynthesis, for 1 month, but they're losing photosynthate through respiration for 11 months, then you're having trouble, gaining in that respect. So by understanding these temporal dynamics, we can get a better handle. And so this is just an example of a very short period of time from the end of July, so certainly post summer solstice, through the end of November. This is blue here is the prairie, which has not had any grazing, and this is the alfalfa in the dark red. And you can get an idea over time. These numbers above 0 would be all net gains. And these carbon gains are what they call ecosystem gains. So we're taking into account the fact that there's some losses at night, but in general, if they're above 0, then they're more of a gain. And so these are the kinds of methods that we use. Here, as we go into the fall, we can find it's pretty real close to 0. So this isn't where most of your carbon gains are happening, of course. So these are the kinds of methods that we use to try to get a handle on what's going on with carbon. Although the carbon stocks, if you just want to know the long term, over millennium, what do we have? Those would be the kinds of numbers that we might have. But if you just want to know, I want to know how seeding this kind of crop affected the net carbon gain over 2 years, you would use these kinds of instruments to understand over a short period of time what is the net gain or loss of carbon. And then just to discuss briefly about some studies about grazing. These studies again are kind of difficult because you're trying to trace what's going on in the whole ecosystem and so this Wilson et al. Study actually quantified the carbon that went to the root tissue and the root exudates, which is a difficult thing to do because it's the root exudates that are basically, exuding that carbon that is eventually being turned into organic carbon in the soil. And when their grazing study, where they said grazing exclusion versus a particular grazing regime, they found that there was less root biomass, less root exudates, and less microbial biomass. So that was this to me is an important study, which in a very limited way, with a limited plants in this one study, they were able to narrow down and say, when you have grazing exclusion, you're not getting as many roots, you're not getting as much carbon coming out of those roots, and those microbes aren't as great either. And so in this case, there was a positive grazing effect. Now, it's difficult to say whether this would be the case everywhere in all circumstances, but it's a step towards understanding. This was an Indian grass, I guess, understanding how to figure out how to do it, because that's methodologically, if you can imagine, it's a difficult thing to do. And then in terms of grasslands as carbon sinks, one study that came out recently out of California looked at how forests and grasslands compare, and in general, most people say, oh, forests, of course, are a much greater carbon sink. However, in this Das et al. Study, they also took into account climate change and the huge amount of forest fires that were going on, and the projected droughts and wildfires that they say might continue. And if that's the case, our forests are really our best carbon sink if we're getting more drought and we're getting more fire. And when I started in 1997, we worked on forests because they were such great carbon sinks. But it turns out that when you consider some of these, when you look at these different climate change models, you might find that grasslands, because of their deep carbon sequestration ability, are actually better carbon sinks than forests. And so that's why in this Das et al. Study, he said that there might be greater rates of carbon sequestration or carbon capture in grasslands in this case. One of the things with all of these things that make it so difficult is that there are so many factors, just like, as you know, whenever you're doing your grazing management, there's a lot of things happening at the same time. So that's what makes it a little more nuanced. But in general, what I found through my own research and others is that by basically, if you can maximize your leaf area, you're going to increase your productivity and your carbon capture. And what I found with the alfalfa was that the leaf area of the alfalfa in this case was extremely high. I measured it, and you could almost see a direct relationship between, given similar soils and similar climate, that leaf area and the net carbon gain. If you can maximize your root density to increase your porosity, your soil oxygen, and your root exudates, you're doing better. And that's where I think biodiversity really matters, because you can really exploit the entire root profile. And with some that are more deep rooted and some that are more shallow rooted being better or less, some being more able to handle drought than others, and getting increasing that porosity so that you're getting that breathing going down deep into the soil, minimizing the soil disturbance, using grazing as a tool to support that methanotrophy or the methanotrophs, those that take up the methane, root growth and turnover, and doing what you can to increase your plant diversity. And those are just citations I used in this talk. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be more than willing to take them.
Thanks, Becky. And I forgot to, and I apologize, Jay, I forgot to introduce you at the beginning of it. So we brought Jay on again this evening, and you've just kind of become my sidekick. So anyway, Jay Fierce. So I definitely wanted to make sure I did that here. And I know Pete Kronberg had messaged me, and he had a question. Pete, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hey, Becky, can you go back to the oxygen slide, the soil oxygen levels?
Sure.
I just got a couple questions for you.
This was such an interesting study.
Yeah. So, okay. On the bottom one, the grassland one, what are the spikes in the graph? I mean, or I shouldn't say what are the spikes. What are they from?
I would think that those are from surface perturbations, where you're getting, if you can imagine that the winds and everything at the surface are affecting that transport of oxygen down into the profile.
Really?
Yeah.
Down, even down to 2 foot?
That is what's amazing about the grassland, which blew my mind too.
God, that's a long ways down. All right. So,
but if you see it at 6 inches and you see the same thing happening at 24 inches, it's like there's that, that they're talking to each other.
Yeah. Okay. And then on the top one, on the crop field one, is there dates on these? January. This is just January to February. Oh, okay. Why? Okay. On the crop one then, why do you get the drops and then it comes back up? Is that similar? Because it shouldn't. The plant obviously isn't transporting oxygen down.
It's
releasing oxygen.
I don't think that's surface. That's a surface response. That's more to me a deep response that's independent from what's going on at the surface. Like
microbial.
Right.
And then then the spike back up, is that also microbial then? Or as it comes back up?
So it could be microbial, or it could be some temperature response.
Oh, okay.
And I'm sorry, I should have provided the temperature profile too. I have that too, but that might help explain it.
I gotcha. Yeah, that's all I had. Thank you.
Sure.
Becky,
Yes.
I'm curious because you've got a lot of experience in this and been a lot of places. And I get it. There's a lot of variation, but from a grazing coalition standpoint, as we're talking to people on this whole carbon issue, are you finding that, an intensive grazing, planned rotational grazing system is generally way better at sequestering carbon than season-long grazing? And can you put any kind of, again, generalities? I'm not trying to put you in a corner because obviously there's a lot of difference, but I think it would be helpful for us if, is it 10% better or 50 or what? I'm just looking for some thoughts with all your experience on if we can make some generalities or not.
Yeah, I understand. I'm just looking up I think it was a 1 or 2 year rotational grazing study that I did in New Zealand where, I found that there was a net carbon sink. And unfortunately, I don't have off the top of my head, I can get back to you, but I can exactly how much of a difference there was. But yeah, we found that the intensive grazing did increase the soil organic matter, and that was using these really sophisticated instruments.
Okay.
So, and it was, every day, day after day after day. And let me see here. So I will get back to you so that you know for sure what we found. In that instance, there have also been studies where we've looked at, stocks over 50, 60 years.
Right.
And we found that, yes, there is more soil carbon there. That one is a little bit difficult to nail down exactly, what, but we found, yes, the grazed system compared to the ungrazed had more soil carbon. And I'll let you know how much exactly.
Okay. Well, and that leads into my bigger question. And I've been on several of these Zoom calls lately with these national groups, and the new administration's gung-ho on climate change. And several of these groups are doing a fair amount of lobbying, one way or another, but there's a general push that agriculture can, I'm not going to sit here and argue, we could argue how climate change is happening, all this stuff. I don't want to get into politics here very bad.
Yeah.
but you get all this, but for the sense of the group here, but my point in this is, okay, most of these groups are sincere that they want to go down a path that we develop policy that rewards agriculture for the benefit it can be in this scenario.
Yeah. And
I'm not trying to pin you down here, but I'm looking for how do we approach this as as from the Grazing Coalition, as policymakers, and it's been all over the place. Some groups I don't think are sincere, but that's the politics of the world. But how do we, when we get on these calls or we're in these forums and scenarios, how can we push this so agriculture is part of the solution and we get some benefit out of it? I'm just, you've been, again, you know more about this than most anybody I know, and I'm just looking for answers because this thing's moving very quickly, and my fear is it'll pass right over agriculture if the wrong people get a hold of it, and we won't be doing the right thing. So, I'm just looking for answers.
Yeah, and that's, you really hit it right there. And I just need to, I think that question can be addressed. I just need to focus my attention on answering that directly and looking at all of the evidence and thinking about, okay, how can we present this in a way that people understand, that is supported by science,
Right.
that would allow so that the grazers that are helping to mitigate and helping to capture more carbon are getting some sort of credit for that, right?
Right. Well, that's the ultimate goal, but even just to make sure that agriculture is looked at as a solution, there are some groups out there that are promoting cattle be removed from the land and that sort of thing, which is scary, goes down the wrong path for groups like ours. And we've got to be at the table in these things, and I'm just looking for ways to convince folks that we are the solution. I believe we are, and I think most of us on this call believe that. And I'm not trying to pin you in a corner or anything else. I'm just trying to figure out how is the best way for us, using people like you and people like Jay Fear and all the other people that we have access to here that know a lot more about it than I do. But as we go into these groups and try to influence policy for the benefit of agriculture, how do we do that? And I think, we need to be talking about that, because this thing's moving very fast. I saw a letter, that wanted some ranchers to sign on to. There's no way I could have signed on to it. It didn't say anything about agriculture. It talks about green space, and a lot of things for city folks, and not that some of that isn't important, but it didn't even mention animals in it or anything like that, or grasslands. And I'm concerned, and this had the administration's name on it, and there will be some folks influencing this that don't really like agriculture all that much, or cows, and we need to be paying attention. That's all I'm saying. And
you are absolutely so right, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because we need people like you out there and others talking about the importance of agriculture and helping these people understand. And so much of it is, okay, the people that are making these decisions, that have this influence over policy, they need to be told, they need people like us to get with them and explain to them what's going on. And it's not entirely clear, I think, to them how this all works. And so I agree. We need to have a strategy, basically,
right.
to pull this off, and to get them to see to see the evidence and look at it and say, okay, look at people like you and others that are on this call that are actually doing this stuff in the field, and looking at what the potential effects are on carbon, and getting this message to these people that make these decisions. And so we just need more, probably more discussions amongst us about how we address this.
No, I think you're right, and I don't want to consume everybody here. There's a lot of other questions, I'm sure, but I appreciate your honesty and your intelligence, and we can carry this on. I think we need to in private or amongst the coalition. So go ahead, Trish, take a hold of your meeting. I don't want to get off on a tangent too far. So.
This is Ken. I was just thinking, just comparing, like, say, a season-long pasture to a totally managed pasture, with a short time in, and the amount of production there, you got way more grass plants. So wouldn't you be sequestering way more carbon? So it's not just because it's rangeland; it's how it's managed. To me, I think it's a tremendous thing.
You bet.
Yep.
Go ahead, please. Rebecca, you want to respond to Mr. Miller?
I completely agree. It's about production and productivity, and if you can improve your production, you're by and large improving your carbon in your ground. And I agree wholeheartedly. All that needs to be taken into consideration.
And just something to ask you also, Rebecca, in regards to what Kenny also just brought up, when so many times livestock are kind of pointed at as, they're the issue. And but when they're used as a tool, and you were touching on that a bit with the plant exudation, and there's really some good data that shows that most green plants will have their major carbon exudation in the first 1 to 2 months, and then eventually it's going to set a seed and it's going to move the other way. But what I'm seeing in some of the data that you presented and what Kenny brought up as well is when the livestock are used as a tool to maintain vegetative state longer, and the regrowth scenario at a good stage in there where it still allows that, and then we can see some kind of increase in plant exudation. And that really came to light at the Minokan farm last fall, rather, I guess, when we did the after 11 years, we did a bit more detailed work. And interestingly enough, all 10 fields had different crop histories. Okay, the field that gained the most carbon was a field that we grew corn for grain, and then it was managed graze in the fall. And the following year, it was a full season cover crop that was managed grazed, and then back to corn for grain. So it had that sequence for a number of years, and all 10 fields had different sequences, some much larger, some much smaller, but that particular field had the most livestock impact, and it had the largest carbon gain. And so much what you just said with the root masses, deep root, tap root, fibrous root, shallow root, all the root masses in for instance, a cover crop combination or a native grassland. We got to bring the livestock to play here as the white knight in shining armor. I mean, I think we agree with that. But what you pointed out to us, those studies correlated with the vegetative leaf area.
Yeah.
And so that's good data.
That's a great point. Keeping it more in a vegetative state is you're exactly right. You're exactly right. We tracked phenology and that really makes a difference. And grazing it to keep it vegetative makes a huge difference.
Trish, do we have another question?
Yeah, Dave, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
All right, yeah, this is Dave, and I really like the presentation and stuff. Thank you. But one thing that I have trouble with, and I think a lot of us do, everybody is getting this message that says cows burp and make methane and carbon dioxide. I'm getting told by the government that I need to eat more grains and less meat. And Bill Gates is saying, hey, I got this fake protein substance that I'll sell you, and I'm going to give you something that'll make you all better if because I got a shot too for you. And we're out here saying, okay, there's all these scientific studies, and you can take, we got a cycle where the oxygen goes in the air and the cows eat, and then they recycle they're already looking at, hey, look, there's a squirrel. Okay, once I start to try to explain all this, they don't care anymore. They need, how can we put your presentation and many things just like that into cows burp and there's more stuff in the air, something simple like that, so that we can get a message out. And maybe we got to break it up into pieces. Where do we start and how do we get there, I guess, is what I'm questioning, because we're losing the battle, and the money is behind having something else. Elon Musk I don't know how many people tweeted him pictures of cows when he said, I got $100 million to figure out a way to get carbon out of the air. Well, cattle do it, but they don't want to spend money on buying more steak and eating at home. How do we break into that thought process, I guess is what my question is. I'm sorry for rambling.
Oh, no, I appreciate it. And Jerry and I have been talking about this a while, and you're absolutely right. The message of let's blame the cow is really, really, really unfortunate. And you're right. We need to get to these people that are and explain to them that carbon is a cycle. Carbon is taken up by plants and it's used by the ruminants, and it's, goes back into the ground. And this idea that cows do nothing but pollute is really, really unfortunate. And there's so many different ways of putting those numbers together, if you will. And I'm not exactly sure why cows have been to blame, because quite frankly, I really, as far as from what I can see, flaring methane is probably more significant than cattle methane. So it's weird how it's turned out this way. And we just need to get together and figure out a message that these people will listen to. Don't you think?
Well, I think that and the other part is when they're doing these studies, they're paid for by somebody, and all of the cropland stuff, and I'm sure that flaring of the methane is figured into the cows' production and all that, just because, well, they had to get gas to get the animal moved from North Dakota to Nebraska, so we better figure that in too. And I don't think it's getting figured in when they go, okay, we're making ethanol for corn or something. So this is all, you don't even need to make ethanol for corn because there's already gas being made. You know what I'm saying? Corn that land could easily be used to finish cattle on, and you wouldn't have to have any of that. So I think people are trying to come up with a complicated answer to a pretty simple question. And if we could just come up with a simple answer and let people know that, it would be we would be further along.
I like it. I really like it. A simple answer. That's a great approach.
But we seem to be coming at it with complicated answers, and I like that you're doing these things to back up everything that we're saying, but how do we simplify it?
Okay, well, I'm gonna have to work on that.
Well, I think you touched on it already, Becky, really. And one thing we maybe could look at is what enhances the food and home for methanotropes. And so if we can make that viable in our grasslands, or work toward that, not that there's probably going to be any one particular item in terms of addressing an issue, but that certainly would be part of it. I think you showed in your presentation, we've taken most of that portion of the soil food web out of our croplands. But how do we enhance their home and their food with our management, and how can we enhance it?
Yeah, you plant more, you have more perennials and more deep-rooted species, and so that there's some diffusivity, because as the oxygen goes into the soil, that's what the methanotrophs need. So the oxygen as well as the methane goes into the ground.
So the bulk density you brought up and that type of thing.
So yeah, you reduce your bulk density, you increase your porosity, you increase your root biomass and diffusivity. All that is going to help the rate at which those methanotrophs will work. If that would be a simple answer that people would understand.
Very good. We were ready for another question from the group. If anyone would like to unmute and ask a question.
Okay, can I jump in? This is Gene.
Hi, Jean.
Absolutely.
Good evening, everybody. It's just an observation and also a sort of following what's been discussed here and what you've shown, Becky, on your spikes and curves on your chart. So in a 20-year period, this is quantified from NDSU, ARS, and Grass and Streeter, who has been out here. We had up to about a 10x improvement on rooting depth enhancement versus the old years of season-long grazing. And is that also a parallel with your curves there? It isn't just it goes deeper.
I love that. That right there, Gene. I mean, like what you and Jay were saying, that really encapsulates what a really great mitigation tool. You get more roots, you get deeper roots, you get more exudates, you get more soil carbon, stimulates those microbes and that exudation as a result of grazing. Maybe it's as simple as just getting those roots down under, and by virtue of that, you're getting the through, and then having the diversity for that, and by virtue of doing that, you're improving your diffusivity, your methanotrophy, your carbon uptake, and your carbon exudates.
This was some work from Dr. Jimmy Richardson in years past.
And maybe that's, what I don't know what resonates with these people that blame cows, but if I don't know if there's a way of packaging this and sort of showing them here's your deep root profile of a grazed system, and explaining to them how it works and how much carbon you're sequestering. We're not the only ones that have found this. I mean, there's a pretty comprehensive book out there that basically says that they're actually using, they're actually using grazing to try to mitigate some climate change because they know it's so important for soil carbon in the Arctic. So we're, it's out there.
Somebody has.
Go ahead. But sort of a lull here. If I'm still on, I guess I started doing some organic or OEM testing about 1990, and I've had, so I could say I have about 30 years of it. And let's see, it was about 10 years ago, all of a sudden we had a period of wet years with heavy soil saturation. And all of a sudden from year 1 to year 3 in the wet saturation, all of a sudden we had a crash in say 25 to 40 depth, and took a long time to figure it out what thought I was doing wrong. And it was just a simple natural indigenous sulfur in the soil, releasing the carbon and moving, and the water movement in the soil, water moves downhill, just carrying it with it. So it isn't always just a straight line. There's always some quirks that come in.
You're right. Yep, there's some heterotrophic processes down below that influence that for sure. Whichever your water table would be a big factor. But yeah, we basically just we need to put our heads together and think about who do we need to reach and how do we reach them, basically, to get this message across, don't you think?
just the simple studies, I mean, that you've shown us tonight, and the ones from the Minokan farm, I mean, they're very on a, a small scale, but at the same time, you multiply that times how many thousands of acres that are being managed that way. And that to me is something that needs to be put out there in front of people that, need to hear this message. And, we need to stop people from vilifying livestock and make them, like Jay said, the white knight in shining armor, because the mentality definitely needs to change.
I agree. I agree.
Well, and we probably got off to maybe a slow start in speaking for livestock, speaking for them on the land, because I think back the last however many years, and at one time I don't think we were standing up and supporting them, and then I think eventually we started to get organized, and we started to get groups like the Grazing Coalition, etc., and we got a bit more organized on it. And then so it's an evolving process, but how this works is you have to tackle that issue before it gets to that tipping point where we can't bring it back anymore.
Yeah.
So that's what's critical, and I hear what Dave is saying in regards to something simple, something effective, and it's it's got to start with conversations like this evening.
Yeah. Another question that came in, and a little bit of a comment with it. It says, it seems to me that most folks, not all, when blaming the cow, are thinking about feedlots and not grazing animals. If that distinction could be made to policymakers, would that help? And then the second part of it is, any data, experience, background in differentiating cattle on grass versus cattle in feedlots? Is there an appetite for that discussion?
Well, I'm sure there's some data on it. Jerry, I don't know whether that's something that we want to discuss or not.
Well, it's a great point, but our problem is always in the beef industry. When we become fighting amongst ourselves, we get absolutely nowhere, and the enemy wins. And and I'm not saying you're not right or I agree with some of that. I think you're exactly right. There are, and I'm sure we can show some of the negative is there, but it's a dangerous path to go down. I'm not saying we shouldn't go down it some. It's the same with those of us on the Grazing Coalition that are raising grass finished beef. I'm always sensitive that we don't tackle grain finished beef. I mean, I think you tell the positive side of grass finish without running the other folks down. I think, because in my own experience, I found the consumer eventually gets so confused that they don't know what to do. And any of you that heard me speak, I say this all the time: perception becomes reality if you like it or not. From all the thousands of people that have went through our ranch, I can tell you the perception of agriculture is very poor. And we've got a job to change that. And this job of, and Jay, you said it, part of the problem that we never stood up for the cow was the lifestyle change in agriculture of getting rid of cattle, because folks, there was a lot of hard work. And, some of us have tried to bring us back to nature a little bit and make it a little more fun again, hopefully. I mean, it's never perfect. You still have problems, but I think you're exactly right. And we never stood up for them, but we didn't understand how important they were. And all we would have had to do is go back and look at the hundreds of thousands of head of buffalo that made the grasslands beautiful and abundant. And you always reference Lewis and Clark's journals that said grass was saddle high and abundant. And over years and years and years of season-long grazing, we narrowed the species, took that away, and we didn't have much to brag about on carbon sequestration probably, but we do now, and somehow we got to get that message out. And I know from like the Partnerscapes board, they're lobbying Congress right now. They're on a major Zoom across Congress, and they're talking about these issues. And that's my point. There are some really good people on there that are telling the right story. There are some people even within those conservation groups that aren't telling the exact great story. They're a little, they're still not 100% sold, and which is risky. Again, we end up confusing the consumer, and once you confuse them, I think they run to, Dave, like you said, Bill Gates, and they go, well, this is simple, it looks the same every time, and yeah, if I hold my nose, I can eat it, and you go down that path. So Becky, I agree with you. I mean, we've got to work together. We've got to figure this out. And for everybody on this call, the North Dakota Grazing Land Coalition can't change the world or fix everything, but I do think we have a real opportunity to make a little bit of a difference. And even in North Dakota, where we think we're so rural, we're getting so removed from agriculture. Lots and lots of folks that come here, I know they don't really know much about where their beef or anything else comes from anymore. So again, we're all about education. We're all about spreading the word. So whatever that is, and I love the dialogue. I love everybody's input. It helps us as we try to figure out how we can do some things different. And I'll say this, and then I'll shut up. Because we have people like Jay Fear and Trish and Becky, we never had that before in the Grazing Coalition, where we have, and that's partially because there's several of our partners on here tonight that are helping us with dollars. That's a huge deal for us to be able to do some things just like this Munch on this series, and then educate on methane and carbon, and hopefully find a way where agriculture can get rewarded a little bit. So I really appreciate the dialogue.
Let's take one more swing at something. Trish, I didn't mean to get in front of you there, but.
No, that's fine. I was just going to add to Jerry's comment in the fact, you're talking about the grass-fed versus grain-fed, and it is a touchy subject, but the base of it still goes back to one thing, in my opinion, and that's, whether you're a grain-fed or a grass-fed guy, you're still a cow-calf person, and you still have those cattle out on the ground, and you're still rotating them through pastures, through weaning. So even we need to come together on the same playing field, and we need to work together, not be on opposite ends of this, to move forward and push our agenda, if you want to call it that. And like Dave said, we don't have the big bucks to back us, but we do need to unite together, because at some point in time, that animal was on grass, and they will always need grass, because the logic behind, being born and raised and fed out in a feedlot, to me is not my idea of raising cattle. So,
and the longer those animals are on grass, the more of their methane is being absorbed, if you will, by those methanotrophs.
Right.
Great point.
Here's just an idea, but and Becky's presentation might be the springboard for this. But if we had talking points coming off of this presentation, talking points for carbon enhancement on grasslands, and talking points for methane on grasslands, or methane management, or whatever the right terminology would be. If we had those, or if Becky and others would take a swing at that, it's something that could go out to all of us, and we could use it in our elevator talks. We could use it with tours and groups, etc. And it would be a uniting, the start of a uniting voice of all of us, instead of each one talking it a little bit differently, which is okay. But here you'd have a foundation to work and create your own story from, because you would have those foundation items. I'm just going to throw that out to see what you would think of that, Becky.
I like it.
Good idea.
I would use them at the Minokan farm, and we have a lot of groups come through there. I would use those.
Yeah, I think we could all throw out I could start with some talking points and rotate them around to everybody and see what we can all agree on. And then once we have an agreed upon talking points, I think that would be great if we can all use them, don't you think?
I would
Yeah.
use it.
Yeah, and I think it's just a topic that people don't feel comfortable enough with yet. That, like you said, if you could bullet it down to, a few key talking points, and I don't know, to me, it's easier for some people to discuss than other people, but it repetition, like Jerry said, he's been throwing it into a few of his talks here and there, and the more you do it, the easier it is to talk about and discuss. So
Yeah. And I'm hosting a little carbon workshop in July, so I'll let you guys all know about it, but we'll kind of dig into this a little bit more. And you're right, the repetition really helps. And I can come up with some thoughts, and then you guys can look at them and revise them and see what resonates, and we can at least give it a try. What do you think, Jerry?
Great idea.
Dave, I see you had yourself unmuted. Did you have another question or comment?
Well, I was just going to bring up the fact that most people that sell calves to feedlots, they're only in that feedlot for probably 150 days. The amount an animal is actually in a feedlot and in a situation like that is very, very short. Most of their life is spent out on grass, whether you believe in the feedlot or not. There is very little time that animal, and it's usually just a small percentage of the animals. Also, it's the steers that are going to slaughter in a little bit of time. I think the average is 150 to 180 days. They don't want them there long either. They're getting us to fight amongst each other, and instead of uniting and showing a good answer, we're fighting against each other and doing that kind of thing. It's just and I also think, with the Grazing Lands Coalition, the way we are working, I don't think we should be looking at the government to try to, we can use the government as a partner to help us do things, but the government isn't the answer either. What was it, Ronald Reagan? That's the scariest thing you can find is, I'm from the government, I'm going to help you. No offense, Jay.
None taken. None taken.
but I'm just saying that if there was a way to, we're talking carbon credits and something like that. The worst thing that could happen is if the government took control of how carbon credits are taken care of or something like that. But Jerry, I understand what you're talking about with we could be missing the boat there somehow, but I just don't know. It's a difficult situation, but
I agree with you 100%, Dave, on not wanting the government in the carbon credit thing. But my fear is if we don't, get this turned in the right direction, we could end up with that. That's why I want to be proactive. And again, we can't change everything, but these discussions are all happening while we're sitting around, so we need to be doing what we can.
And I think out of the two big topics that Becky talked about tonight, carbon and methane, to me, I'm just talking strictly from my own viewpoint. I have access to a lot more information on carbon than I have on methane. And so this is an area that we just have not really had the boiled down information on. And so reading some of this information earlier, once I saw this meeting was going to be held, everything seems to impact it to some degree as the whole system on grazing and plant regrowth and transpiration of the leaf and the photosynthetic rate and all these things come into play. And so, to me, I would like to educate myself more on both items, but I got a bigger task ahead of me on the methane.
Yeah, no problem. We can certainly expand more on methane. I studied that for about 15 years.
That's a good start.
I think you should include some of those raw numbers from, whether it's Becky's study or whether it's the Minokan farm information and data too. I mean, just to, as a comparison to say, here's what it's like, with this rotation, and here's what it is like, once you've incorporated livestock into it. And I think people need to understand the importance of that.
Yeah, I agree. And I need to put these numbers, like Jerry was saying, in a usable format, so that you can say, okay, we've done these studies and here's what we found in terms of what the difference it makes with grazing, etc. And that way it can have more practical use.
Any other questions? Oh, sorry, Becky.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if there's anybody else that would like to unmute and ask a question, you're sure more than welcome to.
Hey, I got another question that's slightly off topic though. All right, so here's my question, Becky. Like say pocket gophers, other gophers, when they make their burrows, when they can be quite large, and they crap and everything, and they usually have their the place where they defecate, right? It's usually like a tube that's away from the rest of the tunnel, or a hole, and then they pile a bunch of feed in there too. What happens? Those can be pretty deep. What happens that far down in the soil as far as the rate of decomposition? Is it totally dependent on oxygen levels, or is it mostly just not occur?
Well, in general, decomposition is highly controlled by oxygen, moisture, temperature. In terms of exactly what happens based on studies that I've read, I mean, it's a wonderful question. I'm not 100% sure. If I know some people that have done some prairie dog studies, but whether they've done them to this level, in terms of the chemistry, I don't recall. I can certainly look it up, but that's an excellent point. What's the effect of the gophers on these processes as well? I'm not 100% sure.
You don't have to look it up. That was just curiosity.
Okay.
I had one more question. This is Dave again. Is there an easy soil test or something like that to know how much methanotropes, is that the right word, are in your soil?
Well,
methane eaters.
Yeah. Well, there's methane eaters, the methanotropes. They're a little difficult to culture because they're kind of finicky. You can have a bunch of them there, but what you need to know is, how active they are. But to find out how active they are in terms of how much of the methane that they're consuming and under what conditions they're consuming that methane, that's not a difficult thing to do, but it's just a field exercise that has data that have to be collected in the field, and then you need a methane analyzer. So right now, there isn't really an easy methane analyzer out to use in the field that I know of. And just an assay for methanotropes doesn't necessarily tell you. If you could figure that out, it would be hard to know if that's indicative of what's really going on. But if you wanted to know about your methane consumption, so to speak, in your soil, I did that for years and years. It's not that hard to do. It just takes a little bit of research dollars.
But there is another test that kind of correlates well with that or anything, huh?
in terms of just being able to say, okay, let me take a soil sample and send it in for a soil test.
Well,
Right?
Well, for instance, if you increase your organic matter 1% in the soil, you're gonna keep 27,000 gallons of water in an acre of land, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like you're actually measuring 27,000 gallons of water, but you know that if you have that much organic matter, you're going to be able to capture that much. Is there? It's not necessarily I want to know exactly how many methotropes are in my soil, but if I've got so much nitrogen or if I have so much activity in my soil, is that like a Solvini test or something like that? There's nothing that correlates that you specifically have to look for that one thing. There's nothing that tells you the health.
That's a super awesome question that I wish I would have investigated. But the biggest thing with methanotrophy, methanotrophs are everywhere. I mean, all over the world. And the biggest correlation that they found is your diffusivity. So the rate at the ability for that oxygen to enter the soil is the biggest thing that has been found to indicate how much methane is being taken up, because they sit a little bit below the surface. So if you can imagine, if you have a completely waterlogged soil, oxygen is not going to diffuse in there, so the methanotrophs can't do their job. So the diffusivity, or the ability for oxygen to get in, because they need oxygen to do this, is the number one factor, in terms of the physical factor. And if you disturb that soil and you take it, shovel it up and turn it over and everything, the methanotrophs will take a long time before they're able to really consume as much methane again. It's very hard on them. So they love an intact soil that's not, that hasn't been disturbed too much by tillage, for example. You dump a lot of nitrogen on there, and that nitrogen molecule, that nitrogen in terms of ammonium, interferes with the methane. So the methanotrophs are taking up nitrogen instead of methane, and it interferes with their ability to do their job. And so those are the kinds of things that we know for sure, but so much of this is kind of in intact soils. If I were to take a soil core and say, okay, I've got so much organic matter, am I going to have more methanotrophy? That particular question, I haven't really asked. I haven't really checked into that, whether or not you can correlate methanotrophy to organic matter, all other things being equal, but it's a good one.
The other thing could be just if it's an intact soil, just the soil density test or the probe test, where it just tells you how hard it is to push into the soil. That may even correlate then, because of the oxygen being able to fluctuate through the soil.
Right. Bulk density.
Right, there we go. There's that. That's the test. Yep.
Yeah. Bulk density. If you had a bunch of different soils of variable bulk densities, you might find, your methanotrophy is much greater in a bulk density of 0.9 versus 1.2.
Okay, so that would be probably a better correlation than how dense your soil is, as long as it's an intact soil.
Right.
And undisturbed. So even like in a no-till situation where it's cropping, your densities would probably correlate fairly well.
Yep, I would imagine that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
This is Lewis. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I had a question. This is a little bit maybe off the topic, but when we have so many of the supporters of uh, plant-based protein and the way they advertise, I have never seen a really good comparison between uh, plant-based protein and animal protein. In the, you know, the plant-based protein supporters all think, or they all advertise like they have no carbon footprint at all, but I'm guessing it's really large. But when you compare the two, has anybody in this group here, has anybody seen a good representation of the two put up against each other? I'm just between, you know, animal protein, you know, from grazing animals as compared to plant-based protein and what it takes to grow it and all the way down till it's fit for human consumption.
The only thing I've seen is the ingredient list stacked next to one another, which is
Well, that is huge.
quite long.
That is very
versus a
big,
cow.
and they're
Yeah.
not all that great of ingredients either.
Right.
Anyway, it's something interesting because they have pushed back really hard against the those of us that are grazing animals.
Yeah, Louis, the only study that I recall last year I saw was one paid for by the plant-based beef industry. And it was a little bit skewed in their life cycle analysis. Again, with these life cycle analysis, it depends on how you calculate things. And in their case, they were comparing, animals raised completely on a feedlot. They didn't factor in anything to do with grassland carbon. They didn't factor methanotrophy. So that's the problem. Some of these studies don't, it can lead people astray because they don't necessarily tell you the entire story.
Sure, thanks.
I just want to add, Becky said they don't really tell the entire story. They never tell the entire story. That would be a massive amount of data collection. That's pretty much never going to get funded. So just my 2 cents there.
Touche. Well, maybe like some of you have been saying, a key message is livestock are part of the system. Maybe that's part of what a lot of the people that you're talking about have never really thought about, that grasslands were the grasslands that we know that are so rich came from livestock grazing activities, and that livestock are part of it. And maybe that's one big message that the average person has trouble conceptualizing.
I think that's a big part of it, Becky. I also think most of our present day cropping systems aren't capable of soil regeneration from the viewpoint of building soils. And so what built our original mollisols in this area, for instance, is just what you described. It was plant diversity and animal diversity over geological time. And you take a present cropping system somewheres in North Dakota or wherever without livestock, generally means also typically without cover crops, it's really not capable of building it back. And it reaches an equilibrium in some type of more degraded manner, and then it goes from there. And so when you're talking about changing this, I mean, it's without livestock, it'd be a really hindered effort to regenerate.
Good point. Thank you. Yes.
Jay, you've been at the soil health thing long enough. Do you think that the message is getting to our leaders in Washington, D.C. at all as far as soil health is concerned? And
what concerned me, Trish, and you saw the same thing, is when the Soil Health Division started in Washington, D.C. within NRCS, which of the 5 principles didn't make it to the table?
The livestock.
Yeah, the livestock never made it to the table. And so we consider it to be, to me, it's probably the most important principle. Doesn't always start that way when somebody goes down the road, but eventually it becomes the most important one. And when that didn't make it to the table, that's a hindrance. That hurts because it doesn't keep it in the front and the foremost. And had all those conversations, and that didn't mean it happened.
Right.
Yeah. So have we made traction? Yeah, I think we have, but that it could have been better.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing too that I think is, we've talked about, it's like they're trying to pit us against one another as far as whether you're grass fed or grain fed, but it's even on a bigger scale within agriculture when you think about it, because you have plant-based versus animal-based. And right there, you've got the farmers pitted against the ranchers for, trying to produce a product. And there again, we need to be banding together as a group in agriculture, not just, the beef versus the crop guy.
Well, it's a big topic, and like Jerry brought up earlier, it's lifestyles tied into it. It's a lot of this all together, and it's not an easy scenario. It's complicated, and it's got a big human aspect in it, which is always more difficult to deal with.
Right.
If it was just a mathematical formula, it would be so easy.
Yeah.
But it's got all this others wrapped in it.
That's for sure. Any other questions or comments out there?
Becky, that was a really good job tonight. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
It's a timely topic, and Trish and Grazing Coalition in general appreciate tagging along on this. It's meant a lot to me, and I've enjoyed it all. And consequently, I think what Becky brought forward, we need to have more conversations on. It's not an easy one. It's got a good challenge to it, but that's all right. It means it's worthwhile. And so we'll go down that road. But I'm going to turn it over to you, Trish. Again, Becky, thank you, and it was a great job. And I'm going to sign it off with Trish.
Well, thank you, Jay. It's been a pleasure to have you on here as well. So I've thoroughly enjoyed it and had a great time. I want to thank Becky for joining us this evening. I think more people need to hear this and need to learn more about it. And thank Val for coming on. I don't know if she's still on here or not with us as one of our sponsors this evening. And I haven't made any final decisions on this. I'm going to visit with the board a little bit, but I do think here in maybe a couple of weeks, we may try to do a few more of these Zoom calls with some of our other mentors. So if you have suggestions on topics that you would like to hear more about, if you would be willing to either call me or email me. My email is fairingcattleco@yahoo.com. You can also send me a message via the website or Facebook page. Any of those contacts will work. We've had a great run with this. We've had anywhere from 35 to 55 people each night. So thank you for joining us and coming back. Most of you guys have been regulars from one week to the next, so that's been wonderful. Jerry, thanks for coming on this evening, and I appreciate your input and your thoughts on things. So without further ado, I think we'll go ahead and sign off, and we'll look forward to maybe some topics in the future. So thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Trish.
Thanks, Jay. I didn't mean to cut you off the other night. You were starting to say something, and then I was like, "Ooh, end meeting." Whoops.
Yeah, no problem.
Everybody got in the motion of cutting off and leaving, and I was like, well,
Yep.
I better hit the button too,
Right. No, I get it.
Yeah.
Well, at
No, I
least
think it was Mel.
we got Mr. Miller's laptop working, so everything is
We
good.
did. I know, and he's still on here too, so he can still hear us.
Absolutely.
That's good, because maybe then I can pull him on for one of these next ones and get some more knowledge out of him. So
No comment.
oh. No comment. Yeah.
And
I think you'd do great at one of these, Kenny.
very good.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you have a good evening and thank you again. And if I do get some more of these, I'm gonna be calling you again. So if you're willing and able to partake again, I would love to have you back.
We'll just see how it plays out. So take care.
Okay.
Yep.
Sounds
Bye now.
good. Yep. Take care.